Okay, guys, so I want to talk about the position of White Forest in the current meta. We only have one major event so far, which is the NAWCQ. And for those who don't know, there is a big difference in quality between different Yu Gi Oh events. So if you see a deck profile that's like first place at locals, forget that, that's trash. Nationals are very iffy because some nationals are a lot more competitive than others. But generally speaking, you can trust the conversion rates at a YCS or an NAWCQ or Worlds, although Worlds is a different format because it's a combined ban list. And this is the only event we have right now. So I want to talk about, based on the distribution of decks, the conversion of decks, and hand traps versus breakers and that type of stuff, where that puts White Forest, and maybe how we should adapt our builds in the future. I want to talk about what is required of a ban list in the future to save us. And I want to talk about, somewhat speculatively, what Rage of the Abyss means for White Forest and whether our deck will become better after that. So, first of all, there were no White Forest decks in the top 64. I'm not even sure how many people even entered with the deck. I don't know if all of that information is fully out yet. But let's start with the breakdowns and the conversion. So, according to Konami, there were 2,635 duelists. And Fiendsmith Snake Eyes was 25% of that. Then we have Tenpai Dragon. So, I don't know if that's surprising or not. I guess it's a cheap deck, so it should be represented because it is actually like a meta contender. Then we have Fiendsmith Yubel, which I think is a great deck. We have Despia, Ritual Beast, Voiceless Voice, I guess regular Snake Eye, Sprite, Labyrinth, Runic, Kashtira, and other. So there were definitely a few White Forest variants in here, unless they're counting Runic as that, but I know that there was a Runic Stun that topped, and then the Runic White Forest guy did not top. Anyhow, now that we move into the top 64, so this is a lot more important. This is the first point where you have an idea of how good a deck is. So you can see that Fiends with Snake Eyes started at 25% and goes to 45%. So this is an excellent conversion. This is almost double. And this is one of the things that starts to tell you if a deck is the best deck. And I know a lot of you might be like, yeah, we already knew that. But this is the first event that actually shows the impact of Fiendsmith in Snake Eyes. Tenpai goes from 15% to 20%, so it's not as dramatic of an increase, but it shows that the deck is good and it can hold its own, and it probably beats a lot of rogue stuff. Fiendsmith Yubel goes from 10% to 14%, so similar with Tenpai. A lot of the people who entered with Yubel are continuing into the top. And then we start to see a bunch of individual decks like Tearlaments, which is not good, Runic Stun, which is, one of those decks that also wants to win the dice roll, Branded, Fire King Snake Eye, Fiendsmith, Memento, Kashtira Fiendsmith, Labyrinth, Gimmick Puppet, Horus, Ritual Beast, and then I guess, actually I don't know what the difference between Runic Stun and Runic is here, or like how they're counting that. These three decks right here, Fiendsmith Snake Eye, Tenpai, and Fiendsmith Yubel, are the relevant decks. Everything else is basically rogue at this point, so there are only three decks that matter, and also Fiendsmith is the best deck. Now, I wasn't sure if the conversion would turn out exactly like this. I thought that maybe Yubel could have a higher conversion rate, because I think the deck is super good. But this is a really good indicator of how different Snake Eyes is from everything beneath Snake Eyes. Then, if you look at the playoffs, so this was 16 people. This was an invitation-only event, and they could bring whatever deck they wanted, and then I can't remember if it was first place or first and second that would go to Worlds, but this also gives you a good indication of what decks are good or not, because if you can be in a 16-person event and, if you place somewhere, then you go to Worlds, you're obviously going to take a deck that you think could actually do well. So I don't know why this person took Magical Musketeer. I think they did the worst in the bracket, or almost the worst. Obviously, almost everyone was on Fiends with Snake Eye. Then there were some Yubel, and then Lab and Tenpai. So this is also reflective generally of what we're seeing here with the conversion, where Fiendsmith Snake Eye is the best. Then there's Yubel, and then there are other decks. Although Tenpai, as we saw, did have like a decent conversion. Now, if we look at some of the decks here, let's go over some of the trends that we can see. Not a lot of the lists are available right now. We are going to skip Branded because this is basically an other deck, so we can bucket that into the other category. And we generally know what Tenpai already looks like. So There's Yubel, and then there is Snake Eyes. And I think that at this point, you should try to decide, are you going to determine your deck building for White Forest based on going to big events, in which case you have to be able to not lose to Snake Eyes specifically. So like if you're playing in Euros or whatever, you have to build your deck to not lose to this deck. Because Yubel is not a good matchup, you also have to prepare for it, but you're probably going to also expect that there will just be more Snake Eyes players in general. Now, if your locals doesn't have a bunch of meta stuff, then this doesn't really matter, and you can go a different route or a more flexible route. You have more options available to you in deck building. But one of the trends that I noticed is that the Snake Eyes builds are starting to play more cards, because if you look at one of the changes, which is that Closed Heaven can do the full Fiendsmith combo and Necroquip makes that a lot easier, is the deck has become more consistent without there having to be any changes to the main deck itself. Like, even if you just had a single Engraver in the main deck and that's it, and you never drew it, the fact that Closed Heaven exists and you can go into the entire Fiendsmith engine through that alone, in a deck that is very good at generating bodies, means that the deck itself has more pushes. Like, if you get hand trapped a bunch of times and you at least have 2 bodies on board, you still can do the full Fiendsmith combo. Or you can begin with it, like if you've drawn the Engraver, and your opponent has to do something to stop that, and you haven't even used any of your Snake Eyes cards yet. So I think that like what we'll see, let's see if we click on one of these. So if we look at like the first place deck profile, we have 44 cards here. And they have, if we count these hand traps, so 3 Valor, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17... 18, 19, 20. So they're remaining 20 hand traps. So if we go to the probability calculator, and they are on 44 cards, and they have 20 hand traps, and let's put that there. So the least relevant number is what is the chance of them opening at least 1? We know that's going to be basically every game, but they'll open at least 2 hand traps, 76, almost 77% of the time, and 3 hand traps 41% of the time. So it's actually close to half of the time they will open 3 hand traps. And if you're playing a White Forest deck, like I've shown a bunch of different profiles before, I'll just bring up a random one here. You do have multiple pushes through interruptions as long as you see multiple engine pieces. But what makes our deck somewhat fragile is the combination of pieces that you draw can be more or less resilient to hand traps depending on what those things are. Like if you draw a toy box and you're able to set the soldier in the tank, then them having an Imperm or a Valor on the Stellar doesn't really matter that much, because the toy soldier is going to get you whatever you were missing. Or if you had drawn Tails, and this is more popular at 3 in pure versions, then you still have another push with this card. If they have 2 hand traps, so like let's say that you use a Stellar and you send like a bad card, like an Imperm, because you don't have access to the toy cards, and they Imperm that, and then you have the Tails and they Ash that, now you're in trouble, because if you don't have another extender, then you can't really play that well, and so you may be hoping that you're sitting on hand traps that allow you to survive. Whereas if you were to draw, like for example, a Sangenjin and a toy box and an Stellar, and then like a Dark Ruler, and you have basically like a custom hand. It's not that that hand is like particularly unlikely to happen. It's just that it's super volatile, the kinds of combinations that you draw. So there are hands here that play through like 3 or in some cases even 4 interruptions, but you just can't rely on it. And that's the main difference between that and a deck like Snake Eyes, where you actually can rely that generally speaking, your hands are going to be able to extend through a ton of different things. They also get better use out of cards like Beatrice, which will probably be banned, than we do, even though we can do stuff like dump Floodgate and bring it back off of Diabel. That's a lot more susceptible to hand traps and stuff, whereas this could have been a 1-card combo that is going to get them into full combo, and if you don't stop it, you lose the game, and if you do stop it, then they haven't even used their other engines yet. So, yeah, I think the main takeaway right now is that I no longer believe it is an option to play the hand trap route. I feel like you either just have to play breakers, or you combine breakers with the highest impact possible hand traps that there are, like Nibiru or Droll. Generally what you'll hear from people if you look at deck profiles from this event is that Nib is the best hand trap if you pair it with something else. And I haven't tested enough to see if you nib, but you don't have another hand trap, but you do have a breaker, is that still worth playing? Or are you in a position where you're nibbing an Apo and the nib doesn't matter and the Dark Ruler did the same thing it was going to do without the nib? So I'm not sure. But I feel like if you are going to play any build that, whether it has in multiple engines or not, I feel like you probably just need to play a bunch of breakers. And even if you were on a pure version, I'm actually more and more starting to think that maybe you just play breakers and like Droll. Because, Droll, you could argue, should also be paired with something else. So that other thing it's paired with stops the extension, and then those two cards work. But you can't really build your deck to be Droll and a hand trap, because you're only going to see Droll a third of the time anyhow. So I feel like stuff like Dark Ruler, Evenly, Thrust are going to be the solid cards. If we get Duke of Demise, which I'm not sure when that is confirmed for us, which is currently in the OCG, this will help against Yubo in particular, and also give you another normal summon. So that would be pretty good. I'm not sure how highly I would rate Super Poly currently otherwise, but yeah, I guess like we need to think a little bit about how to approach this if we're just accepting that we have to be on breakers. At least it means that we have more space for other stuff in the deck. But I'm also starting to think too that decks like this, the Centurion deck, when you have to play at a bare minimum a card like Gargoyle, which you don't want to draw, and then you also have cards that make your normal summons awkward or your combos awkward if you draw them, like the Trudea and the Primera, it's like, why would you play those cards if you didn't have to? And if the reason is you want to win condition in the Calamity, why not play the Millennium cards? But then you get to a problem of where you're like, okay, if you are playing the Millennium cards, why wouldn't you play the Fiendsmith cards? Because these can be two bodies without a normal summon when you draw any of the starters. And you might as well just go for Closed Heaven and whatever. But then a lot of people can't afford the Fiendsmith cards and whatever. So, and then there's the Runic version, which is like, as the guy in the profile said, so this was my last video, he lost most of his dice rolls after his feature match, and every game one that he didn't hard draw the Evenly, he just lost. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. You were main decking Skill Drain. Your entire ability to break boards, aside from the Evenly, is basically Runic cards, which is not like nearly good enough in this meta. If you draw the one hand trap, which is really there to be searched, it doesn't matter because one hand trap is irrelevant. So I feel like Runic is probably not the play here. Or if you are playing a Runic version, I think you definitely full on commit to the breakers. That's what I was suggesting in my previous video. But after looking over the decks that made it, I feel like you definitely swap out the like the skill drains for Dark Rulers, like for sure. Because you're just giving up every game that you lose the dice roll in. And like, why would you do that? Black Goat, as I mentioned in my previous video, it is better in a Runic version because you can guarantee discard it off of a Hugin. But maybe you could argue that there are other cards like Thrust that you could force to go live to be able to search your Dark Ruler. And maybe, even though our Iris is particularly good in this version, maybe argue that you don't play this because you want to squeeze in like, 3 Thrust or like 2 Thrust and a Talents or something like that. Or maybe even you take it to an extreme and you're like, okay, I'm only going to play 2 Sylvie so I can fit in like 3 Thrust and a Talents. So that would be like, yeah, then maybe you take out the Iris Sword Soul, the Veiler, and one of these. So, yeah, that's basically what I think about like where the current format is. We basically are forced to play breakers because you can't win with hand trap wars. It's just not possible. In terms of what we would need from a ban list, I think, so let's pull up the guy who won right now. First of all, Bestials becoming popular is not good for us because there are only some things you can dodge. Like you can, if they're targeting one of these with the Bestial, obviously you can shuffle it back, but they could also wait until you're doing that and then they could target it with a Bestial. And then if they banish your tuner, in a lot of builds, if you're only on one tuner and that tuner is now banished, then that's not good. So Bestials are really not a good position for us to be in. I don't know if it's worth that we play a ton of Bestials in the main, like Bestials and Breakers, and maybe a Dispatter, so the Dispatter can bring back one of the cards that we need. Like, that could be something worth considering, but then you just have to take into consideration, are you playing less Breakers because you're on Bestials? And then that's just also, like, not possible. Like, it's just not acceptable. This card for sure needs to go. We can't make it as efficiently as other decks do because we have to commit more resources with less follow-up than like Snake Eyes does. So this card needs to go. Obviously, they're not going to hit the Fiendsmith stuff in the upcoming ban list. Apo, I think, is like a likely candidate for being banned because of the direction they've gone in with like Baron and Savage and stuff like that. Yeah, but generally speaking, they just need to take these decks' power down a notch. And, you know, if they were to majorly hit Snake Eyes, they probably wouldn't hit Yubel that much. And then we would maybe be able to tailor our deck a little bit more towards Yubel. And then that would be good for us. I think the Tenpai matchup, there are lots of tools that we have for that. Like we have the Zapper Shrimp for the field spell. And then we have Book of Eclipse for any time when they're not covered by the field spell. The only problem with playing Breakers is that you potentially just get FTK'd by Gimmick Puppet. Or like a Puppet Lock from Branded. But one of the major hopes from Rage of the Abyss is the Furos card, which is way, way, way better than Perulia. This is the one where you discard it, and each time your opponent special summons a monster from the deck or extra deck, which is like every deck a million times a turn, you draw one card. And you can actually use 2 Malcharmi effects per turn. So if you were to draw 2, or if you were to be playing this and Perulia, you could use both of them, and you would get the draws off of both. This card can only be activated if you control no cards, and we're probably one of the only decks that can freely turn off our own board if we go first by using Zapper Shrimp, because this requires a Fish Tuner and Diabell. So just the single Diabell, as long as we've gotten to Diabell, whatever we've been able to play through, even if we can't do anything else with our board, the Diabell can get us go to the Deep Beyond. And so even if we've gone first, if we are maining the Furos, we can use that Furos. Like how we maybe deck build around that, where like, you know, if you don't have hand traps to draw into, you don't want to get OTK'd with like 10 cards in your hand, because then it doesn't matter how many times you've drawn. So, you know, we'll have to see the exact deck building patterns based on how the meta changes after the ban list and coming on to Rage of the Abyss. In terms of the Azamina stuff, there is maybe a small amount of synergy because we can get cards back with Diabell, and so there are certain things that we can cycle through more effectively than other decks, but I feel like these cards are going to be so splashable that you could just do like literally Fiendsmith, Azamina, that's it. Nothing else. Just Fiendsmith and Azamina cards, and that can be your deck. And I don't know how much better Azamina will make White Forest than it will make other decks, as long as it can fit them in, because everyone will want the Omni Negate, and then everyone will want the one that targets a card and sends it to the grave, because you can do that out of turn with the Ophelitis or whatever. Yeah, so basically, I think that White Forest, you should probably just accept that you are losing Hand Trap Wars, and you should probably play something that is Breakers and like take these hand traps out, stop coping. If you are on a build that can play Gallant Granite, then I think you can still play the 1 Veiler and the 1 Nib, because those are part of your combo. But you basically just have to be on Breakers, is what I think. So that's basically my thoughts from the NAWCQ. So I'm going to be going back in the lab and trying to optimize for Breakers, and also just giving up on the Centurion stuff for now, because there are just too many suboptimal draws. But just remember that your locals probably does not have the same meta distribution as the NAWCQ, so you don't have to pay too much attention to this if your locals isn't that competitive, and you can do basically what you like. So anyhow, thanks for watching, and if you want to join the Discord, the link will be in the description below.